Episode 1: The History of Forestry and Fire in Oregon. Outside of the original 13 states, most of the continent was claimed by Great Britain, France, Russia, and Spain. In the late 1700s, the land that would become known as Oregon is claimed by the British. 1793, the Oregon country is being explored by the British, French-Canadian Northwest Company. In 1803, the United States acquires land from Napoleon through the Louisiana Purchase. President Jefferson commissions the Corps of Discovery to explore the vast territory acquired by the Louisiana Purchase. He appoints Captain Meriwether Lewis to lead the expedition. The famous explorers Lewis and Clark are several years behind the British and French Canadians in their exploration of the Oregon country. In 1810, the Northwest Company has already established the first fur trading district in the area, known as the Columbia District. In 1811, an American succeeds in creating the first American settlement by opening a fur trading post in Astoria. But the War of 1812 brings the threat of British troops into Astoria, leading to a sale to the Northwest Company in 1913. Fort Astoria was renamed to Fort George and became the first British port on the Pacific coast. As a result, what we currently know as Oregon, Washington, and Idaho is under de facto British administration and control. However, it's only limited to trading posts and forts and the small settlements that grew up around them. The United States and Britain negotiated the Anglo-American Convention of 1818. It was agreed that the 49th parallel would mark the boundary between Canada and the United States, which runs from the Lake of Woods in Minnesota to the Rocky Mountains. The two countries agreed to joint occupation of the land west of the Rockies to the Pacific Ocean. In 1921, the Northwest Company is absorbed into the Hudson Bay Company. The Hudson Bay Company discouraged all colonization as it threatened their monopoly on the fur market. We can say that Lewis and Clark paved the way for American fur trappers who explored the West. The trappers paved the way for missionaries, and the missionaries paved the way for settlers. The settlers gradually broke the British claim on the Pacific Northwest. The Oregon Trail is initially a horse trail, forged by fur trappers and traders. By 1836, a wagon trail had been cleared to Fort Hall, which was established as a fur trading post for the Americans. The first migrant train was organized in Independence, Missouri. But in an effort to discourage settlers, the British established Fort Boise to intercept business from Fort Hall, where abandoned wagons of discouraged settlers was beginning to accumulate. The company's stranglehold on the region was broken during the Great Migration of 1843. An estimated 700 to 1,000 immigrants left for a 6-month trip to Oregon. Settlers established the Oregon Country Provisional Government. Prior to 1861, the wagon trail ended in the Dalles, where wagons needed to be disassembled and floated down the Columbia to Fort Vancouver. In 1846, the Barlow Wagon Road was completed to pass around Mount Hood. Also in 1846, the Oregon Treaty designated the south half of the Oregon Country as United States property and the north half as British. In 1848, the U.S. portion of the Oregon Country became organized as the Oregon Territory. An estimated 2/3 of the male population in Oregon went to California for the gold rush. In 1855, the Panama Railroad across the Isthmus of Panama was completed and provided rapid transport from the east coast to the west. Upon admission to the Union as the 33rd state, Oregon is given sections 16 and 36 in every township to generate revenues for the Common School Fund. The country is in turmoil and headed for civil war. Northern Republicans proposed a Homestead Act, but was blocked by Southern Democrats that wanted the western lands open for settlement by slave owners. It eventually passed in 1860, but was vetoed by President James Buchanan. After the southern states seceded from the Union in 1860, the representatives left Congress, leaving the Republican Congress to pass the long-delayed bill. 1861, the Americans are embroiled in civil war. Abraham Lincoln signed the Homestead Act into law on May 20, 1862. It allowed anyone that had not taken up arms against the U.S. government to file an application to claim 160 acres of unappropriated federal land within the boundaries. The Timber Culture Act was passed to encourage growth of timber on the western prairies. This gave homesteaders an additional 160 acres of free land, provided that they planted 40 acres of trees. After planting the trees, the land would only be obtained if it was occupied by the same family for at least 5 years. 1866. Congress established a land grant to promote rapid completion of the railroad line. This line connected the Central Pacific Line in Marysville, California to Portland, Oregon. The O&C Railroad was deeded 12,800 acres per mile of laid track, which provided an incentive to complete the railroad. They were required to sell back some of the land to qualified settlers. When they didn't, Congress took back over 2 million acres. The Oregon and California Revested Land Acts of 1937 established that those lands were classified as timberlands to be managed for permanent forest production. The timber was to be sold, cut, and removed in conformity with the principle of sustained yield for the purpose of providing permanent source of timber supply. Several large fires burned across the landscape. Can anyone tell me when Fire Prevention Week is? Fire Prevention Week commemorates the Great Chicago Fire, the tragic conflagration that killed more than 250 people and burned over 2,000 acres. The myth that Mrs. O'Leary's cow tipped over a lantern and burned down a town has proven to be false. But the fire did start in the vicinity of the O'Leary barn. A reporter admitted to fabricating the story to make it seem more newsworthy. It is believed that Mrs. O'Leary was made a scapegoat because she was an Irish Catholic immigrant, which was despised at the time. The true start of the fire is unknown, but the fire made national news. This led to legislation for fire-resistant building construction, fire prevention regulations, and increased fire suppression training and funding. Ironically, the National Fire Academy is built on the foundation of the O'Leary barn. While this was an important event in the history of firefighting, it wasn't the only lesson given that day. The Peshtigo fire destroyed a swath of forest 10 miles wide and 40 miles long in 2 hours. Despite taking a back seat to the colorful story of Mrs. O'Leary's cow, Peshtigo remains the worst recorded fire in North American history, destroying over 1 million acres of property and timberland and taking between 1,200 and 1,500 lives. The fire started as settlers were attempting to clean up the logging debris in the usual fashion, by burning it. Even though summer was over, fire season conditions persisted and they quickly lost control. The Forest Reserve Act of 1891 established forest reserves. The Transfer Act of 1905 transferred management of those reserves from the General Land Office to the Bureau of Forestry. This is now known as the U.S. Forest Service. Fast forward almost 40 years. The Big Blow-Up torches 3 million acres in 36 hours. The Great Chicago Fire was a catalyst for structural firefighting. The Big Blow-Up has a similar effect for wildland firefighting. It traumatized the nation so much that Congress was forced to spend federal money to fight forest fires. Oregon introduces legislation for the first forest fire prevention laws. Did anyone see planes? Pulaski the fire engine pays respects to Ranger Ed Pulaski that saved all but 5 of his 45-man crew by forcing them to take refuge in a mine during the Big Blow-Up. Ranger Pulaski is also credited with the invention of the Pulaski tool. Concerned county landowners started to form forest protective associations to help provide fire response to their lands. Also in 1911, the first Oregon forest fire laws were enacted. A state board of forestry was appointed, and the first state forester was appointed. Thus, the Oregon Department of Forestry was born. Out of the ashes of the Big Burn rose an aggressive fire control policy. For the next 100 years, we stomped out every fire as fast as we could. It is ironic that the lessons we learned from the Great Chicago Fire and the Big Blow-Up contributed to the problem the U.S. faces today. Many conifer forests have now missed several fire cycles due to the strict fire exclusion policies, and also the expanded road systems increasing access. Those unnaturally thick forests have fueled many of the super hot fires that have swept across the West in recent years.